So yesterday, the Muslim holy month of Ramadan began, and Muslims around the world began a daily period of fasting and prayer, acts of charity, and self-reflection. And the first reference given to the month of Ramadan, to Ramadan, observing it as a fast, is found in the second chapter of the Quran. And in that chapter, there are detailed instructions given to the Muslim community as to how Ramadan should be observed. During the daylight hours, from the time of sunrise to sunset, Muslims are to abstain from eating, from drinking anything, even water, from sexual relations, from smoking, from actually taking anything into their bodies that they would normally do during their regular days. And during those hours, they're encouraged to engage in doing acts of charity and hospitality and in prayer and periods of self-reflection. And fasting has been a spiritual practice for thousands of years in most spiritual traditions. It varies from faith to faith. Within Hinduism and even some forms of Buddhism, fasting is a common practice. Usually it's an ascetic one in those traditions, engaged in by sadhus or holy men and women who subject their bodies often to extreme periods of fasting in order to end their attachment to the material world and to rid themselves of desire. In fact, it's said that when the Buddha was seeking enlightenment, just before he had his night of enlightenment, he was sitting underneath the bo tree, and he had been fasting for so long. He was emaciated, his body was broken, and he was sitting there and he was subsisting, the myth and legend goes, on 1 grain of rice a day. So they do this in order to punish the body, to break free of bodily restraints. We've become very familiar in the West with images of these people, right? Often quite emaciated looking. In some traditions, believers are enjoined to fast for just 1 day. In Judaism, for example, we all know about Yom Kippur. It's a day of fasting and prayer and repentance. It's not the only time that Jews fast during the year, but it's the 1 day that is expected. Some of the more orthodox branches of Judaism, including the Essenes, who lived at the time of Jesus, would engage in frequent periods of fasting as a way of bringing the body under control in order to more fully connect with God, with the divine. Some people believe that Jesus was, in fact, a member of the Essenes or a similar group, and give as evidence his 40 days of fasting just prior to beginning his public ministry, and the frequent periods of solitude that he would engage in. You know the stories where it says that after he had been speaking or healing people and everything, he would go off by himself and he would pray in the hills of outside of wherever he was, or in the desert, or even out on a boat. He would go out. But there's really no evidence that Jesus was a member of the Essenes or any other group like that. And throughout Christian history, the practice of fasting has been engaged in also for the purpose of drawing closer to the divine, of cleansing the body so that it can be made a pure vessel for the Holy Spirit as a method of atonement. We've all seen images of people who punish themselves by flagellating themselves. We were talking about the Da Vinci Code a couple of weeks ago. You remember the guy in that movie beating himself. That happens in many traditions, actually. And at times, Christians have engaged in corporate fasting, as a method of begging God's forgiveness for something, or intercession on national days. And even today, we find Christian leaders calling for national days of prayer and fasting. We've seen that in our own nation, right? The period between Ash Wednesday, which happened a few weeks ago, and Easter is known as Lent, and which Christians are engaged in right now. They're in the middle of that in their liturgical calendar. And although it's not really strictly a period of fasting, it is a period when many Christians give up certain foods or habits for that 40-day period as a sign of repentance and allegedly to engage in self-reflection and charitable work. Now, some Christians that I know do fast for a meal, maybe one each day or one a week during the daylight hours, where they don't eat during the day. It's similar for them to what Muslims are doing now with Ramadan. Fasting has also been used over the years as a method of calling attention to social issues. The person that you probably know most about is springs to mind would be Mahatma Gandhi. He used it as a political tool in modern times in India to protest the treatment of India by the British Raj, by the British Empire. And he engaged in numerous periods of fasting to call attention to social injustices in his day, whether he was first starting out in South Africa and later in India. He also used it as a method to call the people of India to stop their own internal fighting and bloodshed. And if you've ever seen the movie Gandhi with Ben Kingsley, maybe you remember the scene where he refused to eat because Muslims and Hindus were killing each other in the street. And he said he would not eat until it stopped. And the thing about that is both Muslims and Hindus admired Gandhi. They loved him. And eventually the bloodshed did stop, at least for a while. And here in the US, Dr. Martin Luther King followed Gandhi's example on some occasions in fasting. And so did others, people like Dorothy Day and Daniel Berrigan. A number of years ago, I chose to observe Ramadan. I figured I might want to do this. My reasons for doing it were really twofold. I felt that I wanted to show solidarity with our Muslim sisters and brothers in the United States, and it seemed a good way to do that. There's no need here for me to tell you about the many instances of discrimination and violence that happened and have continued to happen against members of the Muslim community in the United States, especially since September 11th. We all know that that violence is often instigated by a few far-right ideologues who continue to disparage Islam and Muslims, and who try to work the populace into a frenzy of fear of that Muslims are going to take over the country. Remember, we've had people say, oh, they're going to take over the country. They're trying to institute Sharia law. They can't point to any specific place or where that's happening, but they know that that's happening, right, in their mind. And in fact, some states and communities have passed laws saying that Sharia law will not be allowed. Go figure. But they do it just in case. And I wanted in some small way to take a stand and let our local Muslim community know that I stood with them. And so when I decided to observe Ramadan, I knew that I would need a little bit of guidance. The Quran is very detailed, and so are the hadiths. The hadiths are the sayings outside of the Quran of the Prophet Muhammad and the teachings of Muslim theologians that have been handed down through the ages. And there are hadiths about how the fast Ramadan should be observed. There are certain exemptions allowed. Pregnant women or women who are in their period, little children are exempt, the elderly are exempt, those people who are traveling are exempt, and those who are sick. Now, in my case, I have a heart condition, so I technically, if I was a Muslim, I would be exempt from observing Ramadan, at least completely. All of those are exemptions. And although what happens is they do suggest that at some point, if you're able to, if you're ill and you get better, maybe you should then observe the fast, or at least observe some period of fasting when possible. So I decided to contact back then via email the Imam, the leader at the Dar al-Islam Mosque in Teaneck, for some advice. And not only did I receive a reply, but I received an invitation to attend an iftar dinner at the mosque a couple of nights after Ramadan began. Iftar is the meal that takes place each night during Ramadan after sundown. Now, I've been in a few mosques in my day, but I'd never been to an iftar dinner, and I didn't quite know what to expect. And what I experienced was an extremely hospitable group of people who, even as I was walking down the street toward the mosque, I don't know, some of you live in that area, maybe you've seen that mosque, maybe you've walked down or driven down that street. And generally people walk, a lot of them live close to the mosque, so they walk to the mosque, and they all greeted me with the usual assalamu alaikum, and peace be unto you, and then are you here for iftar? They were incredibly warm people. And so Imam Qureshi met me when I walked into the mosque, and he continued telling me about what an iftar dinner was, what foods would be served and things like that. And dates are a big thing at an iftar dinner, because they're just, well, first of all, they're so prevalent in the Middle East that it's just something that people eat, and they're sweet. And but all the different foods that would be served, he talked to me about the prayers that I would be seeing the community do. He invited me to join in. I did not. I sat on the side and observed, and he understood that. First of all, I didn't know the words, and second of all, I don't know the ritual itself, and I didn't really want to stand out. He told me about the fact that he was interested about the fact that I was observing Ramadan, and asked me if I had any interest in becoming a Muslim. And I said, no, that wasn't why I was there. And I explained to him, and he appreciated that. And so he was very kind to me. And then there was another Imam who was there, Imam Mikhail Rahman from the Dar al-Umm Mosque in New York City. And I was seated between the two of them and with a bunch of other men in a room, a rather large room, with all this food, and they were interested to find out why I was there and why I was there in solidarity with them. And it was a cordial meal, because this was the day after, if you remember, the Colorado shooting at the movie theater that year. And there was a great relief among the Muslim community, not only there, but all over, that shooter was not a Muslim. And the one thing they did do that made me laugh is they were joking with me. When I did this, I think it was July. So it was a hot month and long days. And they joked with me about how I picked possibly the worst possible year to do Ramadan, to observe Ramadan, because even they know how tough it can be during those long, hot summer months, not to drink anything, not to eat anything throughout the daylight hours. But the second reason that I wanted to observe Ramadan was to show my solidarity with those here in this country and around the world who have little or nothing to eat. I know that I don't really have to cite statistics to most of you here. We all know the extent of poverty and the extent of hunger in this country and in other nations. This country bothers me the most because we're the wealthiest nation in the world. No one should ever be hungry in this nation, but other nations too. There's no excuse for it. We all know, at least in general, what the situation is like. But I needed to do this again for a different reason, a personal reason. It wasn't until I was much older that I realized that growing up, my family was often in the category that today is called food insecure. Even though both of my parents worked, I recall, at least for the first 10 years of my life, many times when there was really not much food, if any, in the house. And there were times when I asked my mother what we would be having for dinner, And it didn't strike me as odd that the reply sometimes was rice. Rice, a staple around the world, right, from many cultures. Generally, it was served with hot milk poured over it the way my mother used to eat it as a young girl during the Depression, growing up in Hell's Kitchen in New York, when she was in a family that we would consider today food insecure. It didn't seem odd that although we had an entire ham that my father had cooked, my father did most of the cooking in our house, thank God. My mother could make rice, and that's about it. Each of us was allowed a slice of ham for dinner because it had to be stretched, the rest of it, to make sandwiches for the rest of the week or for leftovers the next evening or two. And it didn't really hit home to me that as often as we were putting together bags of groceries at the Salvation Army, where we were members, as you know, we would be putting together these bags of groceries to be delivered to many of our neighbors at various times during the year. And or there was a big pantry there that food was stored in that people could come in if they needed anything. That some of those bags were also being made for my family. And so things got better as my parents both got better jobs. And my sister and brother contributed to the family budget. But it really wasn't until many years later that I recognized the fact that my family was poor. And it was years before I would even be willing to talk about this at all. So for me, observing the Ramadan fast seemed one way to identify with those in our nation and around the world who go hungry every night, with the children who may or may not have even a bowl of rice for dinner. When I woke up today, I chose not to eat breakfast. Actually, I don't eat breakfast most days. I eat breakfast, oddly, if we're on vacation. If we're out somewhere, I will eat breakfast. I don't know what the deal is about that, but I do. But most days I don't eat breakfast, and I don't generally eat before I speak, before I deliver a sermon. That's my choice. I could have had a huge, healthy breakfast this morning. But there are millions of people, maybe some of them are our neighbors, who didn't have that choice and who didn't have breakfast, and who may not have lunch or dinner because there's little or no food in their home. I think about some of the elderly people I know, even in this complex that we live in, and I'm not sure, but I wonder how many of them perhaps are maybe skipping on food so they can afford their prescriptions, or vice versa. And maybe they don't have food, some people in their home, because they choose to feed their children. And if any is left over, then maybe they'll eat something. And so it was with these people that I wanted to show my solidarity and to say, I know what that's like. I remember not having enough. I remember wanting another slice of ham or some more rice. I had forgotten. But I remember now, and I'm committed to helping others remember too, and to understand and end poverty and hunger, not only in our nation, but around the world. There's no reason we can't do it. And today, I especially want to remember the people in Ukraine, who, a once prosperous country, reduced now to starvation, poverty. And I want to acknowledge especially the work of those organizations that are helping bring food to them, especially the work of World Central Kitchen. If you know about Chef Jose Andres, the marvelous work he and his volunteers are doing, not only there, but around the world. We need more Jose Andres in the world. Ramadan is also a period of self-reflection and prayer. Now, I confess that I had intended to try again, as I have on a few occasions, to read the Quran. And I read it through once when I was doing my work at your university in religion, but it's simply not a text that grips me. And I think the reason is that it sounds much better in Arabic than it does in English. And I think most Muslims would agree with me. And I've listened to it read more like chanted, actually, on the internet. So if you get a chance, you can do that. Just Google Quran and you can hear it being recited. And in fact, the word Quran simply means recitation, to recite. That comes from the story where at the beginning, the angel Gabriel grabs Muhammad in the cave, and he grabs him around his chest and he forces the air out of him. He says, recite. And so he comes forth with the words of Quran. So in lieu of the Quran, I read a lot of Rumi. And in fact, the opening hymn we sang this morning is based on a poem by Rumi. In fact, the only line that's not in that hymn, come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving, even if you have, what is it, forgotten your vows 100 times, ours is not a caravan of despair. Come, yet again, come. And so I read one of his poems. We sang that song at the beginning of this sermon, but I read one of his poems pretty much every day. And although I have my own sort of spiritual practice, there was something about rising up in the early morning hours and spending that time with Rumi. If you've ever read Rumi, you know what I mean. There was something about not eating during the day, even when I was hungry. Now, I confess I did not fast for the entire day, ever. I just could not do it. But there was something about that that made me feel sort of a kinship with the others who were doing it around the world, either out of choice because they were observing Ramadan, or because they were hungry and had nothing to eat. We take things for granted very often. Food is a big one for me. I love to cook, you all know that. And I love to eat. Heck, I have a part-time job at a cafe here in Westwood, where we live, where I cook, and I have the opportunity to eat some amazing things every day. And I wish I could say that when I eat these days, my portions are smaller and that I'm more mindful about what I eat and when. If you've been to a restaurant over the past, 30 or 40 years, you know how American restaurants serve food. Gigantic, unless it's one of those really fancy, restaurants, and you get a thing that's like this big and you pay $60 for, that's silly. But if you go to a diner, or if you go to a regular, maybe a chain restaurant, or just maybe a regular restaurant, the portions are huge. And generally, you wind up bringing some of it home, right? I wish I could say that that was the same all over the world for people, but it's not. And so I wish I could say also that I was more mindful than I ever was about wasting food. I'm one of those people, I tend to cook too much at one time. Lisa will tell you that I'm still cooking as though all our kids are still living at home, and then some. And I usually might wind up making way too much, and it lasts us for a few nights. And I'm also one of those people who says, it's been in there for 4 days, 5 days, gotta go. When it may be perfectly good. I try not to do that too often anymore. Maybe my cooking too much is a holdover from when I was young, and it's kind of a response to living with that scarcity mentality. And so Ramadan begins again this year, and while I won't be observing it strictly, I will do my best to observe the deeper meaning of it in my own life, and to be mindful and grateful for all that I do have. That's the spiritual awakening that observing Ramadan offers us as people of a liberal religious tradition. or observing any kind of fast from any tradition. A renewed understanding of our interconnectedness with all people in this mysterious web of existence that we call life on this fragile planet that we inhabit. And so I encourage you to give fasting, even for just one day or maybe one meal, a try. And during that time, maybe read some sacred text or a text that is sacred to you. Maybe do something for someone else. Maybe take the money that you would spend preparing that meal and send it to an organization like World Central Kitchen or somebody else, some other organization. Ramadan ends on May 1st, so we have time for spiritual reflection, for acts of charity, for hospitality, and for spiritual growth. May it be so.
If you enjoyed this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video.